Good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you have dialed in from. Welcome to Accessing Databases with HashiCorp Boundary. So thanks again for joining. My name's Zach Law. I'm part of the solution engineering team at HashiCorp. I've been with HashiCorp for just over 2 years now. I come from a pretty strong DevOps automation background, done a little bit of databases back in the day as well. But on today's topic, we're talking about obviously accessing databases using HashiCorp Boundary. So what I would want to start off first with before we actually get into the demo side of things is let's talk a little bit on the database side of it. So we all know what a database is, and there's a few key things I want to highlight with a database. So first of all is that your databases typically hold PII or sensitive data, even if it's not like a custom system or a record, it's something specific for applications. The data that a database holds is typically sensitive. And so what that means is that we want to protect them. We want them to be secure. We typically wall off our databases from the rest of our resources because of how important the data is that they go through and hold. And so irrespective of the importance of the data hold or how secure we need it to be, we still need to be able to access databases to go through and do things like maintenance, where we need to go through and update a schema. We need to do something on the command line that requires us to connect directly to the database. And one of the other things with databases is that typically, or in general for a long time, we've used static credentials to go through and access those databases. And static credentials obviously have some downsides. One is that they're static, they don't ever go through and change, they're long-lived. And we want those things to be more secure. We want to go through and have things like dynamic credentials to go through and improve those kinds of things. But all of these is what makes it challenging to go through, secure a database and to go through and then access a database for any tasks that we need to go through and perform. And so when we look at the traditional workflow for going through and accessing any infrastructure or a database, typically users, they're going to go through and you're going to connect, if you're coming in remotely, you're going to go through, connect through something like a VPN. You're then going to go through and use probably like an SSH bastion or a jump box. And that allows you to normally get through like the firewall to go through and get to the endpoint, which is typically your database. So there's a number of challenges with the workflow overall. First and foremost, like when you actually onboard a user and you give them access to things, that tends to be a manual process. You've got to get the user into AD, into SSO. You then have to go through obviously map all their roles and so forth. But then there's the other part too, which is if you're going through using something like a jump host or an SSH bastion, is that you have to go through secure an SSH bastion. You have to provide access to that bastion. You need to patch your bastion. So there's a lot of maintenance that actually goes on to secure that bastion host. And so once you have gone through and authenticated through the VPN, you've now logged into your SSH box. That SSH box has another problem, is that SSH box, that jump box, that bastion host, is going to have access to anything in front of it from a network perspective. There's no way to really go through and limit, within that network bound what it can go through and do. So it increases the exposure to the network by logging into that SSH bastion. So in the event of a breach, someone who has access to that bastion has access to everything that the bastion can go through and see. And when we look at the firewall side of things, is typically, again, they're going to be sort of IP-based, based on port. You need to go through and try and restrict that through to the actual bastion host that you're trying to use to log into your database. And that doesn't scale nicely when you start looking at more modern architectures. Maybe we're doing something a little bit more cloud native, we're using something that's a little bit more Kubernetes focused. That kind of legacy firewall doesn't really scale nicely. So every time that you want to go through and add an additional host, or you want to go through and add additional bastion, you now have to start going through and replumbing your network to go through and make those works. And so that last part as well is like once you've actually connected to your database, so when you finally get to the database, you've already got your static credentials. Those static credentials have to be stored somewhere. You have to either remember them, which is going to be obviously difficult, but there's a good chance that they're sitting around somewhere. Maybe they're sitting in a spreadsheet. At best, they're sitting in a password manager, but you still have those static credentials, which again increase the chance for a breach. And so what we want to get towards is a dynamic access workflow. You want to be able to log in with a trusted identity, log in with your ADs, your Oktas, your entry IDs. That makes the onboarding side of things easy. You want to go through and have auth-based roles based on the roles or services that you need to actually go through and use. It means things like configuration becomes a lot more stable. rather than jumping around inside the network trying to work out where everything is, you want to be able to just simply select the host or service you want to connect to. Hey, I need to connect to this database. I just need to know the name of the database. I don't necessarily want to have to understand all the different hops and jumps that I have to go through and do. And I want to be able to connect automatically. I want to be able to go through and have my credentials automatically injected into that workflow or dynamically created for me, so I avoid things like those static credentials. And so this is where boundary comes into it. So when we think about HashiCorp boundary, we think of it as sort of as a jump box replacement. So from like a workflow perspective, is that the first thing you do, obviously, is when you log into anything, is that you need to authenticate into Boundary. And so Boundary allows you to go through and plug into all your classic SSO providers, whether it's Okta, Entra ID, you want to go through and use GitHub, we can even use GitHub. But this allows us to authenticate users, meaning that we don't have to go through a lot of the manual onboarding and offboarding processes, helping reduce that friction, making it easier for us to get someone into what they need to go through and access. So once we've obviously authenticated into Boundary, Boundary is then going to go through and start automating that connection through to the end host for us. So we can go through and look at things like having a catalog of all the applications or servers that we need to go through and actually access. We could do things like automated target discovery, so I don't have to go through and maintain that catalog or the list of hosts that I want to go through and connect to. So where things like you have ephemeral IP addresses or IP addresses that are changing, I don't have to go through and actually keep track of it. And so when you decide what you want to go through and actually access into, Vault's going to go, Boundary is going to go through and automatically broker that connection. It's going to go through proxy that connection for us, inject the credentials, and all that's going to go through and be transparent to the end user. So making it a more seamless experience. As an end user, I don't want to have to worry about the underlying network and understanding how I need to connect to something. I just want to go through and connect to something. Okay, so what we're going to go through now is the actual demo component. So I've built a little demo architecture that we're going to run through. So I'm doing all of this inside of AWS, and also inside of HCP Boundary, which is Boundary being operated outside of our SaaS platform. So I've got this VPC sitting inside of AWS. I've got a public and a private subnet. So this is going to simulate sort of different network segments that we would typically have inside of our corporate network. Maybe this would be similar to an on-prem setup. Maybe this is how I actually go through and you've got stuff deployed inside of the cloud. And inside of those subnets, I've got two RDS instances running Postgres inside of them. As I was saying before, I'm running this out of HCP Boundary. So I've got my boundary control plane I'm going to go through and connect to. I'm going to do that through the terminal on my local machine. So what we're going to go through and do is we're going to run what's known as a boundary connect, and we're going to use the Postgres helper to help us out here. We're going to connect or authenticate into HCP Boundary, and then HCP Boundary is going to go through and broker the connection to our first public RDS instance. And then what we're going to go through and do is how do we actually access the private subnet? How do we access the RDS instance that's running inside of our private subnet there? It's walled off. I can't go through and just SSH into it or connect to it from my terminal because it's it's been walled off. So I need a way to go through and access that. So I can go through and use what's known as a boundary worker to go through and help jump into that particular subnet for me. So the two subnets can talk together in some limited capacity. So I've located what's known as a boundary worker into that public subnet. And so my boundary control plane is going to connect to the worker. And from that worker, we're then easily able to go through and connect to that subnet without having to go through and make any jumps or log into any separate boxes for us. And that's what we're actually going to go through today. Okay, so what I have here is I've jumped into my HashiCorp boundary instance here. I'm going to come into my demo organization, come in through to my demo project, come into targets. And so what I've got set up is I've identified that I want to connect obviously to that private RDS instance and the public RDS instance. And I've gone through and set these up as targets. This is how I identify what I want to go through and connect to on the boundary side of things. So the first one, we have a look at the public RDS instance. I've got some details in here. I can say that at the moment I've got this set up as like a generic TCP connection. I just specify what port I want to go through and use, which is 5432. I could go through and set things like the maximum duration or the maximum connection. So this allows me to go through and obviously from a control perspective, limit who and what can go through and connect or how long they can go through and connect for. I've gone through and I've given this an alias to make it easy for me to go through and reference. I want to do like boundary connect on the command line instead of having to, work out what my target IDs or remember IP addresses. I can just go through and use a really friendly alias to go through and access that. I've got some host sources specified in here, which is I've gone through and set up my RDS instance. It's got a host ID. It's got the full address here. So it's got the DNS name that I want to go through and access. And then the other thing that I've got assigned to it is we've got an IP address or we've got a DNS name that we want to go through and connect to. But one thing that it's missing is credentials. How do I go through and provide the credentials? So Boundary will allow us to go through and store the credentials. And I'm going to go through and use a static set of credentials in this first instance to go through and connect. And then later on, we're going to look at using some dynamic credentials later on to see how we could go through and avoid using static credentials. So what's going to happen is that when I want to go through and connect to this particular target, I'm going to go through and specify this alias, specify the database name, and then Boundary is going to go through and take care of all the things for me in terms of, if we looked at it the traditional way, like, if I had to SSH into a jump host run PSQL, connect to that host, Boundary is going to go through and handle all of that for me. So let's take a look at how that actually looks like on the command line. Okay, so I've got Boundary running locally on my machine. Do Boundary version. We can see that I'm running 0161 here. So what I want to go through and do now is connect to that particular public RDS instance inside of that public subnet. And rather than going through and again running like a PSQL and connecting directly to it, I'm going to let Boundary go through and handle everything for me. So what I can go through and do is Boundary connect. And one of the cool things with Boundary is that we can go through and do things like connect to RDP, we can go through and do SSH, but we also have a Postgres helper, which allows us to go through and rather than having to do anything special with SSH channels or anything like that, I can connect directly with Postgres and avoid having to go through and do anything funky on the command line. So do RDS, go public, specify the DB name, which is the generic Postgres one that I'm going to go through and use. And this is now going to go through and set up that connection to that public RDS instance for me. As you can see now, I've gone through and connected in. I check my connection info. We're going to see I'm connected to the database Postgres. The user credentials that I provided, or the username is test. It's already gone through and provided all the credentials. It injected the username for me, injected the passwords for me. I'm hands off for having had to go through and type or remember any of that into it. So I can go through and do my standard operations if I wanted to. I can go through and change into my demo database that I've got set up here. And I can go through and run like all the standard commands, do select all from messages, just like some dummy data that I've got stored in here. And we'll see there's a message, hello, Terraform, Vault, Consul, and Boundary. But now I can go through, do all the operations I need to, and that works quite well. Quit out. And what's really great is that as a part of this, like we obviously track the sessions. We can turn on things like sessions recording. So as part of our compliance requirements, we may need to actually do things like session recording. Boundary will go through, handle all that, store all that data for us. And again, that's all transparent to the end user. All the transparent has to say is, I want to connect to my public RDS instance. And that's all I have to go through. No, they don't have to worry about anything that goes on underneath the hood. Okay, so now that I've gone through and connected to that first public RDS instance, I now want to go through and plug into that second RDS instance that's sitting inside of my private subnet. And so the challenge here is that I don't have access, obviously, directly to it. It's walled off as far as I'm concerned. So how do I get into it? I'm going to go through and use this boundary worker to allow me to go through and connect into there. And again, when I look at the actual configuration for this, I go back into my targets. We see I've got my private target set up here. I've got an alias set up for it. But one of the differences here is that I've gone through and I've specified an ingress worker. And this ingress worker is the boundary worker I want to go through and use to allow me to connect. It's going to act as a proxy for me to connect into that private subnet. And from an end user perspective, I don't have to specify any of this information. This is already configured for me. So that way, when I want to go through and connect, if I say I want to connect to my private RDS instance, it knows automatically that I have to go through and broker that connection through the boundary worker to access that private host. So we're going to do similar to what we had before. I'm going to go through and run boundary connect, but this time I'm going to go through and connect through to the private RDS host. I'm going to go run boundary connect Postgres. RDS private, DB name, Postgres. And transparently, that has now gone through and automatically connected me through to that private subnet. It's proxied that connection through that worker for me. And again, transparent to the end user. I haven't had to worry about any of the underlying plumbing or the network to log into it. I know that I can just type boundary connect to my IDS instance, and boundary is going to take care of the rest of it for me. And same deal as before, I can do all the operations that I would typically go through and do. It's just like I'm using a standard terminal on my box here. I can go switch again into that demo database, go through and run, select all, and away I go. Very simple, very easy for me to go through and connect. I'll quit out of that. Clear up the screen. And so that's just one example of being able to simply log in to our RDS instances to go through and do just some really, really simple tasks. I just run boundary connect on the command line. I don't need to worry about logging into any Bastion hosts or anything like that. If I need to log into the private one, Boundary is going to automatically proxy that connection for me without having to worry about what the underlying network is. But if I want to go through and improve some of these connections, what we've been using at the moment is static credentials. And so I've got a credential store set up within Boundary. That's what allows us to go through and inject these credentials automatically. And you'll see here is that the type of credentials is static. If I log into here, go into my credentials tab, we're going to see that I've got a username and passwords that's set up. Username's test in this case. The password we're not going to go through and see. But I would have to go through and manually rotate these passwords if I was sharing these credentials out amongst users, or if I was going through just giving individual users these particular creds. You'd have to rotate these kinds of things manually. So they're static, they're long-lived, we have to manually rotate. There's an overhead to going through and running that. What I can go through and do is, if we're using something like HashiCorp Vault, is I can actually go through and have Vault dynamically generate and broker credentials for me for my RDS instances. So rather than, again, having static long-lived credentials and manual creds, I can go through and let Vault generate the credentials for me, have them time-based, have them expire after a set period of time, and that helps limit the exposure of those credentials in the event of a breach. So if I have a look at my dynamic Vault creds credential store that I've gone through and set up here, we'll see type is set to Vault. I come into here, I've connected this all up to my actual Vault cluster. We'll see that if I go into like the credential libraries, I've got it talking to my particular RDS one. So it's going to generate these read-only credentials for me as a part of this workflow. And if I actually take a quick look into Vault, the way this actually works is I've got the database secrets engine. I've got these connections to Postgres, or in this case, RDS, and I've got these roles that are predefined. So I've got a read-only role that's defined that I'm going to automatically generate credentials for. So what this actually means is that, again, rather than having username one, password, I get randomized username and password every time that I want to go through and connect. So these are basically use once credentials as far as we're concerned. So if I go through and generate credentials, every single time that I generate credentials, I get a unique set of creds, again, avoiding those static credentials over time. And so what I can now go through and do is that if I come back into Boundary, what I'm going to go through and do is come into that public RDS host. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the credentials that are being brokered. So rather than having the static credentials, I'm going to go through and put in my dynamic ones. So I'm going to add some brokered credentials. I'm going to put my Vault dynamic credentials here, add them in. And now what this means is that every time that I log in using Boundary to this particular public RDS host, rather than using the static username of test and then whatever password I've got associated to it, I'm going to go through and have a new username and password generated for every single session. So every session has its own set of credentials that are tied to the length of the session. So now if I go through and do a Boundary connect Postgres RDS public DB name, connect to Postgres, hit enter. It's connected in. And if I go through and actually do like a con info and have a look, what we'll go through and see is that I'm no longer using that test username. I'm now using this dynamic username and password to go through and log in. If I go through and quit and log in again, what we'll see is that we get a new set of credentials that we're going through and using. do the connection info. And what we can see here, if we just even look at the last 3 digits of the username here, is that they are different to what we were using previously. So as far as this connection is actually concerned, we've used a completely dynamic set of credentials. Again, they've been automatically injected for me into the workflow. As an end user, I don't have to worry about what creds I'm going through and using or how I store them. Is that every time I connect using Boundary, Boundary is going to go through and reach out to Vault. Vault's going to give me these new credentials. And so it really helps that remote access workflow for us, is that we get like time sessions in terms of what we're doing with Boundary. I get dynamic credentials, and that really helps tighten up the posture for our security. So again, if we look at Boundary versus something like a Bastion host, I don't have to worry about distributing creds out, in that traditional workflow to someone to go through and log into. Is that everything is being handled between Boundary, and then if we look at the credential side of things, also a little bit of Vault to go through and help us out. So just one sort of final remark on this is we're not just limited to using like one Boundary worker to go through and connect into like a private or an isolated network. I can actually go through and chain more and more workers together to go through and provide those the necessary bridges to get to wherever the host is living. So it doesn't matter how secure my environment actually is. I can go through and use Boundary workers to go through and help proxy and bridge those connections together. So I don't have to worry about managing the complex underlying network infrastructure, in terms of routing, firewalls, and the likes. I can let, again, Boundary and the workers go through and handle all of that for me to provide a really simple, seamless experience for an end user when it comes to using remote access, particularly when it comes to something like databases. Alrighty, that brings an end to the actual demo side of things for me. So hopefully today, like you guys have seen, just a little bit around how we can go through and use Boundary to remotely access those hosts and without having the complex like network infrastructure in terms of Bastion hosts and distributing creds or anything like that. Boundary really makes that workflow simple for me, is that I can simply say, Boundary, connect me to my public RDS instance or connect me to my private RDS instance, and it'll go through and handle everything for me from, obviously establishing and maintaining the connection, doing the session recording, injecting all the credentials for me. So it really helps tighten up the security side of things. It makes my workflow really easy if I need to go through and connect. Makes everyone happy from an end user perspective, security, engineering. So Boundary, like from a secure access, really makes life easy for everybody. So yeah, if you have any additional questions, feel free to pop them in quickly now before we wrap up. Otherwise, thank you very much for joining today, and we'll join you for another session in the future.